From Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to be discussing some more recent strike action in schools. And we're going to discuss specifically recent strike action at a high school in Rochdale, where members of NASUWT have begun strike action following concerns about pupil behaviour and staff safety. And there's been descriptions involving violence and abusive behaviour, staff saying that their working environment has become unsafe. The Academy Trust that runs the school has said that efforts have been made to address the concerns. They've said that leaders have sought to resolve the concerns around safety whilst also driving improvement. They've said that they respect the right of union members to act where they believe it be necessary, though they do feel that more could have been achieved through dialogue. And today, I'm joined by two members of NASUWT, executive members for Greater Manchester, Rachel Knight and Jack Casson. Welcome to TTR.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, full disclosure, before we start, Jack is actually my former teacher.
Yeah, I take all the credit.
Of history. So thank you for teaching me, Jack. And then obviously I've ended up going into history teaching. So there you go. There you go. Monumental times. Anyway, before we start, I just thought I'd ask you what led to this point with this strike action in this school, which is St Cuthbert's, isn't it?
I think St Cuthbert's is a bit unique in that these issues haven't just happened overnight. They've not just happened over the last few months. In September 2024, NASUWT balloted in that school for all the same reasons. And we didn't need to take action under that ballot because, credit to the trust, they responded swiftly, robustly. They brought in interim leadership. The interim head teacher was brilliant, really hit the ground running, absolutely recognised that what staff were putting up with was completely unacceptable. And things were on the up. And for apparently personal reasons, that interim head teacher left around February, so around 12 months ago. And he was head teacher number 2 in the last 18 months. And then there's been another interim head teacher, and things have rapidly gone downhill. This isn't to blame that particular head teacher. I think we've been very clear that the issues at St Cuthbert's are a failure of the trust to invest in the school and to bring stability to it so that, behaviour doesn't become such a big problem. So things have kind of gone downhill since the interim head left in February. By the summer term and certainly, autumn term, things were going very, very badly wrong. There were extreme behaviour incidents every day, the truancy. The kids aren't going into the classroom. And they're not, they're then running around corridors. We've even had stories of them making TikTok videos on corridors when they should be in lessons. They're not being picked up, and if they are picked up, they're being verbally and physically abusive to the staff that do. Staff that are dealing with the truancy on the corridors can't get to other serious incidents that are kicking off in the school. And we issued notice of that we were going to ballot for strike action in early December, and we didn't get any response from the trust then as to any measures they were going to take then. And, the point we always make is when you've got people who are being injured at work, when you've got extreme behaviour that is impacting our members, it's a health and safety issue. Everyone is entitled to a safe workplace, and the employer's under a duty to make that workplace safe. And I know people kind of struggle to put behaviour in that same bracket, but the duty is, they should have robust procedures in place. They should have a robust system of sanction and rewards. These are the measures that mitigate and that should create a calmer culture. We're all, me and Jack are both secondary teachers. We all know you're never going to get 100% consistency and 100% perfection in managing behaviour in any school. But what's happened here is there's, inconsistency is the norm. Staff being verbally abused has become normalised. And the kind of volatility that there's been in leadership at trust level and at school level has massively contributed to this point where there is no stability in the school, and our members are very clear that they say something really serious is going to happen soon if nothing's done. But I'd argue that when you've got your members being stamped on, when you've got people being crushed in corridor stampedes, it's already really serious. And it's not just our members being injured, it's students as well.
I was going to ask you next, actually, about the nature and frequency of the behaviour incidents that staff are reporting. Can you give us some, sort of really specific examples, if possible, of things that are going on? Because obviously there'll be other teachers watching this saying, well, we're experiencing behaviour in our school. What's the threshold where you're going, well, hang on a minute, this could be strike action. This could be something we need to take further.
I think it's to do with the levels and the frequency. And a WhatsApp group was set up specifically to record incidents. And there was a snapshot of 2 days, and there was it ran to 12 pages.
And it culminated, one day there was a particularly bad day before the February half term, where I can only describe it as rioting at lunchtime. And this was the point where children were crying on corridors, asking cleaners to hold their hands because they didn't feel safe.
Okay.
That's when you're at a point where this is going beyond, right, well, we'll have a look at this policy and it'll take a while to bed in, and we'll put this in place. Because, going back to the health and safety point, if a building's on fire, you don't walk away and go and write a new policy. You don't review a policy. You do something swift to put the fire out. The same with exposed wiring in a wall. You would do something to make it safe. Water on the floor. When you've reached that level of, uncontrolled behaviour in a school that is injuring people, you take swift action.
What are the behaviour policies that the school has in place at the moment?
The school does have behaviour policies in place, but they are not being applied. And in many cases, inconsistencies become the norm. There's clear sanctions in the policy. And, we all know that.
Why do you think that is? Why are they not being applied?
It's to do with staffing and consistency as well. It's having the capacity within the senior leadership to support classroom teachers, heads of department. Because, as much as we've talked about the health and safety elements and the violence and the aggression and the behaviour, this is in the context of a school that resources have been absolutely drained. And that, again, it comes back to the trust. But in terms of the behaviour policy, we've got, so ideas like teachers being required to phone home when children get to a C3 sanction, which obviously is hugely time consuming for them. But in the meantime, where there's more egregious behaviour and getting the help of senior leadership or whoever's on call, taking the children away and bringing them back 5 minutes later, or not applying whatever the sanction should be. Detentions that are being set that the students know that they don't need to attend, because they know that actually all that will happen to them, if not attending the after school detention, is that they can turn up at the lunchtime detention, probably sitting with their friends and carry on having, making fun. So, do you know what I mean? It's that level of sort of where the sanctions don't feel like they're even going to be touching. Is it worth behaving for some children? And that point about in any school, the vast majority of children behave. Yeah, you have your hardcore sort of at one end, and as soon as they start to grow, that tipping point, the ones that sit in the middle are going to head in one direction. They'll either go in the direction of the ethos and the culture that you want to build in the school, or they go in the other direction, and it gets to a tipping point where it is unmanageable.
So you've sort of talked about the policies themselves a little bit there and the implementation of the policies too. You mentioned about the funding. Obviously, this is an issue across the sector, but there'll be those out there who'll sort of say that when it comes to, if you have a behaviour policy and, the policy's in place, it's then a case of following the policy. Do you think there's more of an issue around, adults being scared or you've mentioned some pretty difficult situations that they might be facing, sort of groups of pupils and I don't know what else, are there issues there around implementation that's nothing to do with money?
I think the problem that's at St Cuthbert's is that it has lost a significant number of staff over the years. Certainly staffing and resources is one key element to what's exacerbated this situation. The school became an academy in September 23, and our members believe there are over 20 less staff there now, people who've left and not been replaced. They've seen budgets cut in their department, even though our members believe and Schools Forum figures show that the school was in a healthy financial position when it joined the trust. And what we're seeing, St Cuthbert's is really hard to draw together into one, it's just because of this, because one thing's exacerbating the other. The instability in staffing, there are staff are sick, there's staff that haven't been replaced. There are support staff that haven't been replaced. They're not there to support the effective implementation of those behaviour policies. Children are misbehaving when it's not their familiar adult. We've got teaching assistants who should be with children for one-to-one support, who are having to split themselves between lessons. And so the behaviour policy would work if there was the staffing and resources to implement it. And then when it comes down to the workload of the teachers and the impact on them, their workloads are driven by, there was one member who said they had to prepare cover work for four maths teachers that weren't in the building. And that, yourself, when you get in the morning, it's like there's 4 teachers absent, you've got to set cover work. That's how their day starts. You carry on the day on the back foot. And if you've got, unfamiliar teachers in those rooms and they're not next door to your classroom, you're also running across buildings and trying to deal with the behaviour issues coming out of those lessons to the detriment of your own class and getting your own work done. You're losing your PPA because people are bringing children to you that can't behave in the lesson. And it gets to the end of the day, and then these teachers are expected to make various phone calls, and that's before they get to their planning and their marking. And this is where this isn't a straightforward situation. There are many elements to it and facets that there needs to be a really honest conversation about.
Just before we carry on the conversation, I just want to give a shout out to our partners this morning at NASUWT Learning. The show's brought to you in partnership with NASUWT Learning. They're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. You can visit them at NASUWTlearning.com. We've also got AQA. They know that teachers are the real experts in the classroom and they want to work with teachers. That's why they're the UK's most chosen assessment organisation. You might have already heard of them. And as we enter exam season, of course, you want to head over to the AQA website and check them out. Also, in 2 weeks' time, which is 2 weeks tomorrow, we have Teachers Talk Connect, which is our free annual CPD extravaganza in Manchester. So if you're a teacher watching this and if you live anywhere, you can come along for free. We've got strands in English, math, science, history, RS, oracy, writing, behaviour and inclusion, and much more besides. We've got Ross McGill and Jennifer Webb, who are the main stage speakers, and the event is completely free for all teachers. And you can head over to the website, the Teachers Talk Radio website, ttradio.org/connect26. And of course, Ross has just commented, we can't wait to see you there, Ross. Ross will be doing one of the main stage talks. So yeah, fantastic event, and make sure you grab a ticket for it. So just coming back, Rachel and Jack, to what you were saying, the trust mentioned it could have been avoided through dialogue. I'm just wondering, like, what you think they meant by that, what your response to that is, and what are the specific things that they suggested that you rejected?
They didn't.
Yeah, there hasn't. I think I said earlier, we've continued to raise these issues since September 2024. The trust I said, I can't fault their initial response when that dispute of 2024 began, but they've not maintained it. They've not, continued to make sure that everything's, tickety-boo, if you like. Our local representatives have continued to raise these issues at school level. There was no response to that, which is when it was brought to me. I wrote to the trust on the 11th of December, detailing the serious issues that had taken place just over 2 days, and there was an acknowledgement, but no response. Because they didn't need dialogue to read that I was saying, the Canaries are singing something really seriously wrong is happening in that school, and you need to act now. There was no action taken. There's been no approach from any of the trust leaders up until, the day strike action began. We did have a conversation with the trustees, but the people who are, employed to lead an academy trust and are responsible for what goes on in that building have not been proactive at all.
Why do you think that is, in your view?
I steer away from speculating what somebody's motivation may be, but I think the trust feels like it can, offer a jam tomorrow response where it's, we're putting all of these things in place, and there has been some actions taken which will yield some improvements in the long term, but that's no use to our members when they're going into an unsafe workplace now and they're trying to do their jobs and keep children safe in that building now. And it's not beyond trust leaders to take swift and decisive action. We see, and I'm not necessarily endorsing or condoning. This is for an example. There are academy trusts who, when they take over a school, they swarm the school with staff from the trust level, from other schools. They do a behaviour reset. They establish the principles, and whatever your opinion on it, it's one way that does bring some calm to the school and make sure everyone knows what's expected of them, and brings the consistency and the stability that you need. And then they gradually taper that off and the school gets back to its new normal. But we're not seeing that swift action take place.
I think as Rachel said, we wouldn't speculate on the reasons why, but there does seem to be a disconnect between the trust leadership, and I don't think this is particular to St Teresa of Calcutta Academy Trust. It's something that we're seeing across the board, where the schools are, or where our members are being failed in the schools by their employer, and there's a disconnect between the people who are in those trust leadership roles, and the people who are actually sort of, at the chalk face, so to speak, who are dealing with the issues every day. There are an awful lot of people in multi-academy trusts across England in leadership positions who are on very, very big salaries, and there is a complete disconnect between what they do and what their employees are facing in classrooms on a day-to-day basis. And there are, a number of multi-academy trusts where they've got quite significantly large central services teams, executive head teachers, directors of this, directors of that. And actually, at times, those people need to be in the buildings to actually see what's going on and to, take the temperature of the place and then sort of put measures in place immediately, supportive measures to our members and support staff, not measures against our members and support staff. It's actually genuinely supportive of having more bodies in the building so that support can be given where it's required, particularly in terms of, when you've got a lot of staff absence, particularly in terms of where you've got a lot of behaviour that is causing problems for other students and for teachers.
You mentioned multi-academy trusts. Obviously, you work across Greater Manchester. We've seen the white paper come out the other day, and it seems from there that the government are wanting more schools to move into multi-academy trusts. It's based on what you've said. Do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's a real concern. I think it's a real concern because, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of multi-academy trusts that work well. They operate well. They are good organisations and purposeful. But there are, quite a number that aren't. And some of the disputes that we've had more recently are with the multi-academy trusts. And when you have issues with the school leadership, you go to the trust leadership. Where you've got problems with the trust leadership because they are not being accountable, they're not managing the school leadership, whether for whatever reason they're choosing not to. And then it's a case of like, well, where do we go from there? We can go to the trust board, and we've done that in other disputes and found that really unsuccessful because the trust board are not prepared to take on. So at least with the local authority schools where we've had disputes, collective disputes, we've been able to go to the local authority. Local authority have stepped in. In some places, the governing board has been dismissed. We've got IEBs. IEBs have been put in place because the local authority can recognise that there's an issue. Problem with multi-academy trusts is where do you go once the trust board aren't prepared to step in? And we've got situations in trust board. There's another a Catholic Academy trust. I'm just dealing with one of the schools, not really my area. And you will probably have seen it in Schools Week. They've got a £9 million deficit. Well, who is being accountable? Where does the buck stop? And in the meantime, our members in those schools are facing restructures and potential redundancies. So are we thrilled by the idea that all schools have got to move into multi-academy trust? No.
You mentioned at the top of the academy teams, there's a lot of big salaries, and obviously it's been reported in TES just a couple of weeks ago. They published a list of the highest paid CEOs in multi-academy trusts, and there was quite a lot of criticism and commentary on that, and just across media. And you mentioned that particular story as well with that deficit. I mean, where do you think the money's going? Where is the money? Is it on salaries? Where do you perceive the money to be going?
Well, if you can, our colleagues in our headquarters, our employed staff, produced a document called "Where Has All the Money Gone?" And that sort of really drilled down into where has all the money gone. And if you think about the fact that there's 20,000 plus employers now in England, compared to 20 or so years ago when there was, I don't know, however many, couple of hundred local authorities. And in all of those local authorities, there was a director for education, there was a school improvement team, there was, probably a special needs inclusion team, and an HR provider, payroll provider, IT providers, right? So we've got that, now we've got that duplicated thousands of times. And some of these smaller academy trusts have quite significant central services team, and they're doing the same thing that the school down the road is employing somebody else to do. And that is, so basically it's a duplication. But also, look at some of those CEO salaries, COO, CFO salaries, and obviously the top of the tree is is a lot on more than £500,000 for being CEO. How can somebody who's in public service be paid more than the Prime Minister? How have we got the situation? There's one CEO of a single school multi-academy trust in Manchester that, on my last reckoning, was paid more than £250,000 a year. It's probably more than that because that was last year. One school. It's where has all the money gone? It's in the wrong pockets. That's where it's gone.
I think the problem is because I'm always cautious about saying we need more funding for education. I'm not saying we don't need more funding, but at the moment we're in a situation where there is no regulation of the spend on senior staff at trust level. So we'd probably see more money go into education and more of those positions arise. Teachers have not seen their pay increase in the same way that trust leaders have. And, I am a fan of the local authority model. Both Jack and I have worked in schools 25 years. So we worked under the local authority model, the first early academies that they were only brought in to turn around schools. But then I hear academies talk about, we have collaboration and school to school support. I've got to be honest, working under a local authority school, we had that then. There were local authority days where people in the same, teachers in the same area would get together, they collaborate, they train and so on. And there was always someone there to support. And it came probably at much less cost than the current academy system does. And, academies don't always, well, certainly in the case of the bigger ones, they're not geographically close and based in the same communities and context. Whereas local authorities are very much rooted in the needs of their communities and context.
Just flipping back for a minute to the school situation that we've been discussing and the strike action in the school that's I think it's still going today, is it? Or is it finishing today?
No, they're back in today.
Back in today.
So next week.
Next week.
Tuesday, Wednesday.
So I just wanted to flip back to that and say, what practical changes are you looking for them to make in the short term to make this better?
So going back to what I said before, this isn't exactly a quick fix because, schools don't just end up like this. This has been years in the making. In the case of St Cuthbert's, the current interim head teacher is there until 2027. He's still not a permanent head teacher, has come in and she's taken some actions that will yield results in the long term, but you can't just make that approach. There needs to be a short-term approach, short, medium and long-term approach. I mean, certainly from the academy, they should be looking at, can we get a permanent head teacher in and a solid, consistent leadership team? As well as, in terms of making the school safe immediately, they need to do something along the lines of the behaviour reset I talked about before. I think we all remember it from our school days where you'd at least get the assembly where, the whole year group was read the Riot Act, and the teachers were supported.
Does that work anymore, though? Does that work anymore?
I think it depends, to be honest, Tom, because the one thing I've said about education a lot lately, as we're going down the routes of scripted teaching and scripts to manage behaviour, is that education's lost a lot of its human. It's lost a lot of that very honest conversation you can have with children, where you do build the relationships. I go back to saying 25 years ago, we didn't need to have a scheduled restorative justice conversation with a script in order to talk to a child about, what's gone on. That was really silly. Let's move on. You've done your crime and your time. Let's get things back on. And we did. But I think now there's a much more stilted approach to behaviour. And I think children see through it. So I do think there needs that element of a more personal approach taken, and a good leader. I go back to saying the interim head that St Cuthbert's had that left 12 months ago very much did have that connection both with the staff and the students. He managed to start bringing some unity, but that's not what we're seeing now.
I think that you to answer your question about, does that work? Yeah, it can do if it's done if it's managed properly, and if everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. If everybody, if the staff will be on board with it, if it makes sense, and then the students are told and informed, and the clear boundaries are set out, and if those clear boundaries are set out and people understand those, vast majority of students will conform to that. They do. Most students are, they conform, they're well behaved. There might be some low level stuff, but actually it is not commonplace for most students to behave in a way that's not acceptable. And so once you've got those clear boundaries and set, and you've got a system in place to say, right, okay, we cross the boundary, though these will be the consequences, and those consequences actually happen, and then other children can see it, then that's how it's managed. It's one of those, where we've got disputes, particularly about behaviour, and some of the stuff is sort of like, oh, you want to get rid of all of the special needs children, and you want to just exclude all of these kids, and it's like, no, we don't, because this behaviour is across the country. It's not particular to these handful of schools. It's everywhere, but it's about how it's managed.
And I think Jack's just touched on this. We are taking far more ballots and disputes on the basis of behaviour and adverse management than we ever have. And I think the schools where it's reaching the levels of St Cuthbert's, in primaries and high schools, by the way, we've balloted in 5 primary schools in the last 12 months over similar stuff, is teachers, they're so conscientious, they so care about the children that they teach, that they don't want the children to suffer for the behaviour, and they probably accept a lot more extreme behaviour than they should. We've said, in some schools it's become normalised.
Is that though because I don't necessarily mean in this particular school, but in general, do you think that there's a lot of pressure on leaders and people who are leading on behaviour to not exclude and to not take action?
Yeah, I think they're in a rock and hard place, aren't they? Because the pressure's on them not to exclude. The agenda now is for inclusion, which from what we're seeing is resulting in a lot more, exclusion rooms on site. Then they've got the issue of funding, and put the special needs crisis on top of that. And they are trying to, do the right thing by these children with their hands tied behind their backs.
I think the other thing is, this idea that, very much the latest stuff that's coming from the government and the focus on inclusion, it is one of those things. You've been in education as long as I have, because I'm obviously a very old lady now, that it is the cyclical nature, everything, nothing is ever new. It's just a recycled life. And, you go back to the new Labour government, it was very much a focus on inclusion. That's what the focus was. And, as teachers, our vocation is to give the best opportunities for children to fulfill their potentials. You're going to struggle to find many teachers who are keen to exclude children, but it's inclusion has to be properly resourced and funded and trained for, because otherwise it doesn't work.
Are you seeing, just flipping back towards the violence towards teachers particularly, because that was something that was highlighted here in terms of I think there was one incident you mentioned of the stamping. I think there was been pushing in corridors, shoving teachers, etc. I mean, I don't know if you can give more details on that, but there's that. But do you see that are you seeing similar concerns around violence and towards staff? Is that something that's on the rise? And is it a case that, there'll be some out there who'll say, well, these are changes in society, there's a changes in what's happening, and therefore, actually there's not as much that schools can do, about it.
I think it's one of those that these kind of behaviours have always existed. It's not new. It's just the frequency of it happening, and it's also the and secondary schools generally are more geared up and equipped for dealing with those kind of aggressive and violent behaviours, or disruptive behaviours. What we're finding is that this is becoming far more commonplace in primary schools with very young children. And the primary sector are less equipped to deal with it because it's not something that they've had a handful of children over the years that might have behaved in those ways. We've got primary schools where everything is logged on CPOMs. They don't have a behaviour reporting system. They just use CPOMs. That's for safeguarding. It gets, you can't see the wood for the trees, where you've got people spending an hour and a half at the end of the day reporting or recording incidents that have happened during the course of the day. So in terms of why that's happening at primary school level, how long have you got? I mean, there's a zillion reasons. People point to the issue, COVID lockdown, and all of the incidents of that, but you've got to look at the wider context. That the children that we've got now in year 11 were born in 2010. It was the start of austerity politics. There was 14 years of austerity politics where public funds were cut for everything. Local authority funding was cut. Sure Start, Book Start. Speech and language therapy, child and adolescent mental health, health visitors, the works. That it's been trimmed and trimmed and trimmed. So all of those services, those external agencies that were there to support, develop, nurture children and young people have been cut. They've been taken away, and most of that has been left to schools to deal with. And the parents of the children who are in the early years of primary school, they were the ones who've left school and been, grown up through that. If you take all of the support structures away, can you be really surprised that things start to deteriorate?
Do you think that with this, coming back to the strike action that's currently going on, what sort of would you say to the families and the children that are affected by the strike? Because obviously they haven't been in.
Obviously, no teacher wants to be out on a picket line, Tom. And of course, it causes disruption for families with childcare, and a lot of children won't be in school on those days. However, it came to a real point of conscience with our members, where at the end of the day, those children aren't safe when they're in school. It'd be a neglective duty for them not to raise the alarm and take action to make this safe for everybody. So while there's disruption, I mean, strike action by its very nature causes disruption. But this is in the interest of everybody, that these issues get addressed, and they get addressed robustly and swiftly.
Last couple of questions. obviously, we've seen this particular strike, but we've seen others. And, I was speaking to Wendy Exton a couple of weeks ago about one down in the south there. Sort of not exactly the same, but there was some similar sort of overlaps there and stuff like that. Do you think that, do you think teachers in schools, it's two things really. Do you think A, they strike enough and over things like behaviour, and B, do you think that there's sort of a legal approach as well to this in terms of should teachers be calling the police if they're getting assaulted? Is that something more teachers should be doing? I suppose what I'm getting at here is, what should teachers be doing right now in the context of what you've just described?
Cool. I think start with strike action is always a last resort.
Yeah.
Okay. No one. Believe me, teachers, as I've said, they really care about the children they teach. They want to do their best. We're very conscientious beasts, teachers. The last thing they want is to go on a picket line, and believe me, they don't do it easily. They really don't. But the fact is when you're raising serious health and safety concerns and they're not being listened to, you're not left, you could wait for the health and safety executive to get involved. You could, go to the police if you've been assaulted. But a lot of teachers don't want to do that because we don't want to criminalise children. We want to build children in their life chances. We don't want to destroy them, but everyone is also entitled to a safe school. So I think, calling the police, if there's an assault, we do tell members that it's an option, but it's not one that they often take. I think teachers, certainly the ones where we've been out on strike, realise that they're under a duty, as we all are, in terms of keeping children safe. That when there's an issue and it's not being listened to, then you do have to blow the whistle. Which is what our members at St Cuthbert, Tewkesbury and so on are doing. And I think we need to stop just seeing them as, they're striking over behaviour, let's sort the policies out. Because actually, if we get to that point, someone somewhere in leadership has failed. They failed to carry out their legal duties to give a safe workplace, to keep their children safe in that school. And that's where we're seeing a lack of accountability, certainly more so in academy trusts.
I mean, in terms of what should teachers do, it is, they need to raise it. They need to, and I think, be organised and act collectively, because I think, certainly in the secondary sector, the idea of the old staff room where teachers would meet at break times and lunch times, or even department staff rooms where they'd meet. A lot of new build schools, they don't even build a staff room. People have become really compartmentalised. You walk around most secondary schools at the lunchtime, and you've got a load of people sitting in their rooms by themselves or running clubs because they've been told that they need to run a club. So a lot of teachers end up working in isolation, don't understand that it's happening to the person down the corridor as well. That's why I think it's been different in the primary disputes that we've had more recently. They are more likely to meet each other in the staff room and support each other and talk to each other and realise, actually, this is not just me. This is happening across the board, and they support each other. And where they've come and contacted our, whether it's myself or Rachel or the other local secretaries in Greater Manchester, certainly, where we have found that there are collective issues, it is a case of, right, well, let's organise and let's do something about it. And we don't, it's not sort of like, all right, everybody out, come on. It is a case of finding out what the issues are, taking it to the employer, and asking for their support and asking them to get involved. More recently, some of those situations have been linked with the adverse management of the leadership, at which point we've got to take it up to another level to ask other people to intervene. But it is, what should teachers do where they're facing this is speak to their colleagues and speak to their union and to organise, because when you act collectively, you have got such a stronger voice.
Jack and Rachel, thank you ever so much for coming on and discussing this. Hopefully it's shed some light on it from your side, from your point of view, and we'll see how things pan out. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in and listened this morning. And obviously, if you're listening back to this as a podcast, thank you very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share it if you found it useful. Or if you've heard anything that you think should be shared on, then please pass it on. We're going to be back later on today with more shows and more content. So make sure you do that. And of course, if you've watched this back on Facebook, we've just hit 10,000 followers on Facebook. So thank you very much to everybody who has given us a follow on Facebook and any other social media that we are on. And of course, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Amazon Music. If you are just listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to head over there and like and subscribe and review as well. Thanks to Ross and all the other people, Mark and a few other people who've made comments during the live. So yeah, we'll be back again. And thanks very much, everybody, and take care. Bye.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from